Hi, I'm Nancy McCabe. I'm the author of From Little Houses to Little Women, Revisiting a Literary Childhood, and 9 other books. And I'm very pleased to be talking today with Pamela Smith Hill, who's a Laura Ingalls Wilder scholar and the author of numerous books, most recently, Too Good to Be Altogether Lost. Can you hold that up, Pamela?
Yes. Voila.
Okay. And so just to jump right in, one of the things that I really appreciated about the book is the way that you situate Laura Ingalls Wilder's work in the context of children's literature. You detail groundbreaking aspects of the books that I think are so entrenched now in children's literature that we take them for granted. So I was wondering if you can talk about some of those.
Of course, I'd love to, but it's so good to be here. Hello, everybody. And it's a delight to talk about Laura Ingalls Wilder with you, Nancy, because I happen to have a copy of your book here. So I'll show this to everybody. And I really highly recommend it. It's a delightful and wonderful book about visiting important literary sites, including all the Little House books. But to get back to your question about the groundbreaking aspects of Wilder's books, I think we have forgotten how revolutionary the Little House books were back in the 1930s and 1940s when they were written. And I detail a lot of these points in my new book, but I just want to summarize very quickly some of the most important points. And I think the first one is the sense of realism that she brought to all of the Little House books. Now, we all have our favorite details from the Little House books, whether it's that pig's bladder that they played catch with in Little House in the Big Woods, or when Laura Ingalls Wilder got her teaching certificate at 15 on that wintry night. So those we all know and love, but I'm talking about the deeper, more emotional aspects that brought a sense of realism to her work. And I'm really thinking about a comparison between the details in Little House on the Prairie, for example, and Caddy Woodlawn. Both books were published in 1935. And Caddy Woodlawn went on to win the Newbery, which is the Oscar of children's literature. And Little House on the Prairie received absolutely no attention from the American Library Association for any awards during 1935. And I think it was because Wilder brought a sense of darker, deeper emotional response. In the 1930s, a lot of people were writing about pioneer experiences for kids, but they really focused on the adventure. And certainly there's a lot of adventure in the Little House books. But Wilder lingers on how Laura responds to those emotions. And sometimes she thinks very, very dark existential thoughts about them. And you get that in the very opening of Little House on the Prairie when the family gets caught in that flash flood crossing the creek. And Wilder writes that Laura realizes that the creek could have rolled them over and over and over again and swept them away, and no one would ever have known they had been there or what happened to them. And that's a really dark thought in a children's juvenile book in the 1930s. And Wilder repeated this throughout her career. Now, by the time she wrote On the Banks of Plum Creek, the literary establishment was beginning to take notice of this new realism. And her editor at Harper Brothers used Little House on the Banks of Plum Creek as a model for other writers who were interested in juvenile fiction. And the American Library Association gave Wilder a Newbery honor listing for On the Banks of Plum Creek. So she was beginning to gain some traction with this new realism that she was bringing to the books. And that continued throughout the rest of the series. But rather than continue to write kind of safe middle grade fiction in the 1930s after On the Banks of Plum Creek, another major change that Wilder made was she jumped from middle grade or juvenile fiction with On the Banks of Plum Creek into young adult fiction with By the Shores of Silver Lake. And as a pioneer of young adult fiction, we've kind of forgotten that Wilder actually wrote for young adults. And I think this is a huge achievement because without the young adult fiction that she wrote in the 1930s and 1940s, we wouldn't have books like The Hunger Games now, which is a novel series about survival, just as The Long Winter was. So Wilder pioneered a category that was just emerging in the 1940s. And in fact, the American Library Association didn't recognize the young adult category until 1958, a year after Wilder had died. So she was truly, truly a pioneer.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that I really appreciated that you bring out that I guess never occurred to me when I was a kid is how Wilder's writing about disability. When she writes about Mary, I mean, I read lots of children's books where there was sort of a saintly disabled character, usually a girl, who, you know, because of her disability, she was like just this saint. And I think you really bring out the idea that Mary is like a full human being, and that this is an early portrayal of disability that is kind of groundbreaking.
Yes, and this is another groundbreaking achievement that Wilder pioneered in young adult fiction, because Mary has a future, and Wilder doesn't linger on the illness that caused Mary's blindness, nor does she make Mary too saintly. She's not a Beth March, as Alcott portrayed a disabled person or someone fighting a very deadly disease in Little Women. It's interesting to see that Mary remains uniquely herself. She's very practical. She's very pragmatic. And as I said, she has a future. She goes on to college. So this was a very novel idea to present in young adult fiction during the 1930s and 1940s. And in fact, Wilder's daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, discouraged her mother from bringing Mary's blindness into the rest of the series. And can you imagine the rest of the Little House books without Mary's blindness?
Right, right. Well, one thing that I really liked about your book also is the way that you detail the writing process, that Wilder went through in writing each of the books. Like you take them one by one. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what new insights you bring to looking at that process.
There are several quotes that Wilder made describing her writing process, and I just want to share them really quickly, and then I'll expand on the idea. But in a letter to Rose, she told Rose that the only way she could write her stories was to wander along with the story idea and rewrite and revise and change it everywhere. Which I don't know, Nancy, you write fiction and so do I, and that sounds very familiar. And then in the 1940s, she answered a correspondent who was asking about her writing process. And again, I'm paraphrasing. Wilder said she just has to keep plugging along and plugging along. And it's part memory, part inspiration, just part sweat and hard work. And that sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night and have to get up because suddenly the right word or phrase had popped into her head. It was something that she had been struggling with. And so she would get up in the middle of the night and write. And again, I don't know about you, Nancy, but that description also sounds pretty familiar. But Wilder, of course, had a really unique relationship with her first editor, which was her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, who was her kind of secret editor and first reader. I don't think anyone at Harper and Brothers knew that Rose Wilder Lane was editing her mother's book. But I do think what's really interesting, over the years and decades, a lot of people have talked about Rose Wilder Lane's contribution to the Little House books. And as an editor, they were certainly important. We can see that in the editorial letters the two of them exchanged. On the other hand, we have forgotten that without Laura Ingalls Wilder's autobiography, Pioneer Girl, which wasn't published until 2014, Rose Wilder Lane wouldn't have had the writing career that she enjoyed. She drew directly from Pioneer Girl for her two novels and many of the short stories that she published during the 1930s. In fact, her mother's stories, which Rose Wilder Lane sometimes borrowed very, very heavily from, kept that career going into the 1930s. So I think that was really important, that the two of them had a unique editorial chemistry that we'll probably never completely understand.
Yeah. Well, so one of the really crucial subjects to address, of course, is race and racism, their role in the books. And one thing that I liked about the way you handle that is that it feels like you're definitely not denying it, you're not being an apologist for it, but you're taking a very measured and thoughtful look at the way that Wilder handles those issues. And you talk about them in the context of Wilder writing historical fiction. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think this is a really meaty and important discussion to have about Wilder's work, because in fact, I want to go back first and talk about her groundbreaking work. Because, I mentioned that the publishing establishment and the American Library Association was a little slow to recognize Wilder's contribution. And so finally, in 1954, they created the Wilder Medal to honor her work. Now, many of us have heard about the Wilder Medal, but she didn't receive the medal because she was a sweet old lady writing sweet little stories about her past. I want to read a quote from Ursula Nordstrom, who was Wilder's editor at Harper and Brothers. And she pointed out that the reason the American Library Association gave Wilder the medal in 1954 was because she had made a distinguished, creative, sustained contribution to children's books. I want to repeat that: a sustained, creative, distinguished contribution to children's books. She was awarded the medal because of her artistry. And now, of course, in the 21st century, we've forgotten about the artistry, and we've really focused on the racist issues that have emerged over the years. And the racist ideas that many readers find disturbing, and I do too, we all do. And of course, in 2018, the American Library Association stripped Wilder of Wilder's name from that medal that was created in her honor. So we've forgotten about the artistry. We're now focused on other aspects of her work. But I think what's so interesting is that several adult writers have also come under attack for their racist ideas, and yet they're given a pass because they're simply trying to recreate the time period, the attitudes, the feelings, and the language that people at that time would have written. I'm thinking about Ernest Hemingway and Flannery O'Connor and even Mark Twain. That's not to say that the racist ideas that appear in Wilder's books are not disturbing. They are. But I think it's important to note that Wilder was writing from a child's point of view. So in particular, in Little House on the Prairie, Laura, the fictional character, is confused by what she sees. She's confused about why they're living in Indian territory when Ma doesn't like Indians. She's confused about the hateful speech that she hears from her neighbors. And so all of that was very real for a child of the prairie growing up in the 1870s as a white, basically squatter in Indian territory. So all of that is very realistic. And I think looking at the historical context, as disturbing as that can be now, can illuminate the times that we're living in today, when children are hearing hate speech routinely, and when we hear all kinds of negative comments about immigrants and homeless and all kinds of minorities. So in many ways, what we see in Little House on the Prairie and even the Little Town on the Prairie reflects and grounds the kind of racism that kids today are experiencing. And I think that is, I think it's important to share that difficult past because it helps kids understand where we are now. That doesn't mean that we give Wilder a pass or we give white settlers a pass for how they talked about Native Americans in particular during the 19th century, but it illustrates that racism has always been a part of American history, and we're still struggling with it today.
Yeah, I really like the way you do a close examination of how the text itself questions some of those attitudes. They're not just presented, um, uncritically in the book. So, for anyone who joined late, I'm Nancy McCabe, and I'm talking to Pamela Smith Hill about her book, Too Good to Be Altogether Lost. So I really want to talk about the first 4 years. So, which goes back to that question about the process of writing the books. I'm so sorry. So when you discussed the first 4 years, that actually really blew my mind. That book was always in the box sets of Little House books that I was given as a child. And so I never thought of it as not being a part of the series, and yet it felt so distinctly different. And I think that a lot of readers have felt that way and been puzzled by how different it is in subject and tone. And, when I read William Holtz's book, Ghost in a Little House, he kind of uses that as evidence for, yep, Rose Wilder Lane did have a very significant effect on Wilder's prose, because look at this book that didn't go through Rose's typewriter and look how different it is. So obviously, Laura didn't know what she was doing. And I really love the way you have a totally different take on this. Your theory is so fascinating. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Well, I first read the first 4 years when it was published, I think in 1971. I remember reading it as, I think I was a senior in high school, junior or senior in high school when I read the book, and I was disappointed. I thought, this just doesn't feel like a Little House book, and Laura's character is different, and why is Almanzo called Manly? And why is Laura so mean and so reluctant to share Almanzo's dreams? Because certainly in these happy golden years, she was very supportive of Almanzo. It just didn't make sense. And so the explanation in the beginning of the book is that, she took it up after Almanzo died and she just kind of lost heart. And of course, the book was published after her death. So I was always haunted by that. And then when I wrote my first book about Wilder, Longest Wilder, A Writer's Life, I reread a book by Rose Wilder Lane called Let the Hurricane Roar, which was published in 1932, the same year as Little House in the Big Woods. And for all of you out there who've never read Let the Hurricane Roar, its main characters are Charles and Caroline, and they're newlyweds. And the book was written for adults, and it appears that Laura Ingalls Wilder knew nothing about this book before it was published. And most of the episodes in Let the Hurricane Roar, in fact, all of them, sprang from Pioneer Girl. And so when I was writing Writer's Life, I was struck with the parallels between Let the Hurricane Roar and the first 4 years. And I thought, that's really interesting. And as I said, Let the Hurricane Roar was written for adults. And it seemed to me that the first 4 years was also written for adults. And I began to see some parallels between the two books. And then when I came to write Too Good to Be Altogether Lost, I wanted to go back and re-examine those parallels. And I thought the best place to start was to look at the original manuscript of the first 4 years. And I will just say that there is a big hint within the rough manuscript about when that book was actually written. And the book appears to have been written, the manuscript appears to have been written in late 1932 and early 1933, long before Wilder envisioned an entire Little House series, long before she had written these happy golden years. And so that just revolutionized the way I was thinking. And there's correspondence throughout the 1930s where Wilder hints about writing an adult novel. She never does exactly come through with it. but the hints continue into 1937, into 1940, 1940s. And she had even contacted her editor at Harper Brothers about writing what she called a grown-up book. And of course, she already had the rough draft. And what I think is really interesting is that her editor at Harper's at that time in 1937 said, "Oh, we'd love to see an adult novel from you, but you have to work with an adult editor." It wasn't envisioned as a continuation of the Little House series. So all of that is really interesting. There's a whole lot more details in the book about the many parallels, the structure, the major plot, the characters. I think, in short, that when Wilder wrote the first 4 years, she was patterning that book on Let the Hurricane Roar. So it isn't that this was Laura Ingalls Wilder's unadulterated voice. It was Laura Ingalls Wilder mimicking Rose Wilder Lane. And I just thought that was fascinating.
That's so fascinating. Yeah. So, by the way, if you're watching this and you have any questions, please post them. If you have anything you'd like for Pamela to address. Oh, okay, great. So while we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions, Pamela, I was wondering if you could talk about the title of your book, Too Good to Be Altogether Lost, and where that comes from.
The title comes from Laura Ingalls Wilder's 1937 Detroit Book Fair speech. And the context is that she was talking about her father's stories, the stories she heard from childhood from Charles Ingalls. And she thought they were too good to be altogether lost. And that's what inspired her to write Little House in the Big Woods. And because there have been so many objections to Wilder's work in the 21st century, primarily because of those attacks of racism, I thought it would be interesting to go back and reread the books and re-examine them afresh and really see what they were about. And so when I came across that line, "Too good to be altogether lost," from her Detroit Book Fair speech, I thought it makes perfect sense as the title for my new book, because I think it's important to go back and rediscover Wilder's work, explore it yourself, and make some new discoveries and see how her work has influenced what's happening today in children's literature.
Yeah, I really love the way that title resonates. So I know that you just returned from Laurapalooza and presenting about your book there. And while we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions, I'm just wondering what kinds of questions you were asked there. Like,
oh, here we go.
Oh, wow. That would really color your
I'm kind of surprised that if you read the first 4 years for the first time, you were inspired to go back and read the first ones, because it's so very different. The first book I read in this series was Little Town on the Prairie. Unlike, I grew up about 40 miles from Laura Ingalls Wilder's farm, Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri. And unlike most kids from my generation in Missouri, my school teachers didn't read the books to me at school. I found out from my neighbor, Opal Scott, and she recommended it to my mother because she knew I was a bookworm. And so I went to the bookmobile. That's where we went to the library in those days. And the only book on the shelf was Little Town on the Prairie, and I was hooked. What about you, Nancy? What was the first one you read?
You know, my mother read me Little House in the Big Woods when I was 3 years old, and she had grown up down the road from where Laura Ingalls Wilder was writing the books. They passed the farm regularly, Rocky Ridge Farm, but she hadn't even heard of Laura Ingalls Wilder until some years later when she first started teaching school herself. So you know, she had felt this personal connection to her, though, because she had, you know, been writing the books nearby. And so I just remember sitting on the couch and listening to my mother read Little House in the Big Woods to me. So I read them pretty much straight through. I'm really impressed that Sarah started out with the first 4 years. But looks like we have another question here.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question. What is the biggest misconception about Laura Ingalls Wilder, Rose, and their work that you wish people understood? That's a really good question, and we could do a whole streaming event just on this one. But I just want to say two things. I think first, everybody assumes that Laura was really indebted to Rose for the voice and the creativity of the Little House books. And yet, very few people talk about how indebted Rose Wilder Lane was to her mother's work. Not only did she pick up characters and plots and settings from Pioneer Girl, which was unpublished, she actually went in and picked up sentences and full paragraphs and just kind of massaged them a little bit. And she used abstract vocabulary versus the beautiful, lyrical, concrete vocabulary that her mother used. But you can see that there's a description of sunset, for example, that appears in both Rose's Pioneer novels. She pulled that out directly from Pioneer Girl. And so I think if the two had not been mother and daughter, Rose Wilder Lane would have rightly been accused of plagiarizing another writer's work. And that's something that we have forgotten. And then, too, there's a lot of give and take between Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane as Wilder was writing the Little House books. And this is normally what happens between a writer and an editor. An editor will say, oh, I think you need to cut this character, or this setting doesn't work, or this opening doesn't work. Can you rewrite it? And then the writer will come back with different ideas. And if you look at the editorial correspondence between mother and daughter, you see exactly that. So it isn't unusual for a writer and an editor to have that kind of exchange. While writing fiction, what is unusual is that they were mother and daughter and that they kept that editorial relationship a secret.
Another question?
The question is, the original manuscript to the first 4 years, is this manuscript available to read? It is available as part of the archives of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in Iowa. And I believe you can still contact archivists there and ask them for a Xerox copy, but they will charge you for that, and then you have to pay for postage as well. Question, I teach at a community college and many of my students talk about loving the series. Why do you think that today's generation still loves the series? Well, I'm delighted to hear that a younger generation is still reading these books, because when I travel, I usually talk to adults who are still in love with the book, and children not so much. So I'm delighted to hear that children are interested in the Little House books. But I think in part it's because Laura Ingalls is such a vivid, strong character. And getting back to that relationship between Rose and Wilder herself, Wilder's strength was in her character. She understood them so well and so believably. And the motivations, the feelings, the emotions all seem so real to a young reader. And Laura herself is a lot like Jo March. And, Jo March and Little Women have transcended generations. So I think there are many parallels between Jo and Laura, so that Laura still feels very contemporary. And I think that's one of the reasons why young readers can still be drawn to the Little House books.
Let's see here, another question.
I've wondered why Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote Farmer Boy's dialogue in an older English, and then Almanzo spoke in a more modern way in all the other books. That's a really, really good question. In part, I suspect it was because, first I want to say that when Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote Farmer Boy, and a lot of people don't realize that it was the second book in the series. A lot of people think, oh, she wrote that at the end. It's the second book in the series, and it's kind of a mirror image between Little House in the Big Woods, which is about a frontier family in the West in the 1870s, and Farmer Boy is a story about a boy's family in the East in the 1860s. Perhaps that shift in dialogue was to illustrate the difference culturally between a frontier family and a more settled family in the East. But I don't really have, that's just my opinion. I don't have a definitive answer on that. Nancy, do you have any ideas?
This is such an interesting question because, I really haven't read Farmer Boy. I think I read it once as a child and once as an adult. I skipped over it. So I'm really fascinated by this question, and I have to go back and look at the book.
Well, I have to say Farmer Boy is kind of the mirror image of Little House in the Big Woods, but it also was groundbreaking too for Wilder herself as a writer, because it focuses on Almanzo very clearly as the main character, because in Little House in the Big Woods, it's an ensemble cast. And I think an argument can be made that Pa is the main character in Little House in the Big Woods. And so Laura Ingalls Wilder was writing a book about a boy, and we follow him completely through that story. On the other hand, it's also, I think, the most traditional of her Little House books. It follows the more traditional pattern of juvenile books from that period. And I also think perhaps it, more than any of the other books in the series, reflects Rose Wilder Lane's editorial vision. I'm not sure about that, but I suspect that that's the case.
Other question. Let's see here.
Oh, yes, this is a good question. I teach Wilder to adults by pairing Little House books with countertexts, like the Logan Family series by Mildred Taylor, the Betsy Tacy books, and contemporary revisions. Do you have any countertexts you like to pair with the Little House book for deeper and contextual understanding? Yes, I think if you're looking for more frontier stories, there's obviously Hattie Woodlawn, but there's also a series by Florence Crennel Means that was published in 1931. It's very hard to find. It's a book that follows the family of Janie Grant. It's a three-book series, and Janie, like Laura, experiences. The book is set in the 1870s in Minnesota. The family experiences a grasshopper plague. There are Native American characters sprinkled throughout the book. There are prairie fires. There are deadly winters. And like Laura, Janie goes on to become a school teacher and aspires to be a writer. So there are several books from that period that deal with the frontier experience. I also like the Birch House book series to give a Native American perspective. I think that's a beautiful series, and I recommend it very highly. I suspect the next Netflix Little House on the Prairie series will inspire a resurgence of interest in the books? Yes, I do. Because when the original Little House on the Prairie series premiered on NBC in the 70s, there was a resurgence of interest in Wilder's books, and I think that will happen again. Good question. Yes, and I'm looking forward to it too. Do I have any insight, opinion on the introduction to On the Way Home, which was published after Rose's discovery of the first 4 years manuscript after her mother's died? I've always been vaguely disturbed by the way Rose chose to portray her parents, herself, in that introduction. I will say, I kind of hesitate to say this, but our friend and colleague William Anderson, who is a premier scholar in Wilder and Lane research, and I have talked about this often, and we really wonder if that incident of the missing $100 actually happened. That Rose Wilder Lane was very loose with the facts of her life, so I'm not certain about that. But I think a good way to get some insight into the relationship between Rose and her parents is to read Rose Wilder Lane's novel Old Hometown. And I always hesitate to say that fiction is autobiographical, but I think it gives us a glimpse into what the family dynamics might have been. And so I really encourage you to read Old Hometown. It is still in print, I believe. I think you can get a paperback from the University of Nebraska Press.
These are, excuse me, really great questions. Let's see, let's take another one here.
Oh, I have compared her books to Willa Catherine and Bess Streeter Aldrich. It's Bess Streeter Aldrich. Do I feel a similarity? Yes, I do. And in fact, at Laurapalooza, when I gave my presentation, I mentioned Willa Cather and Bess Streeter Aldrich. Of course, they wrote for adults, but Wilder was writing in that tradition, that literary tradition in the early 20th century, which continued from the teens when Cather's books were published into the 1940s and even into the early 1950s about pioneer experiences. And so books were written for adults, and for young readers. And so, yes, I totally agree with you that Willa Cather and Bess Streeter Aldrich were writing in that same tradition and had a lot in common with Laura Ingalls Wilder. Another great question. We talk about the relationship between Laura and Rose. Do you have any comments on the relationship between Laura and her mother? Well, mother-daughter relationships are always interesting. And I think there were moments when they were both very irritated with each other and disappointed with each other, perhaps, but also very loving. And if you read some of the letters that they exchange, like mothers and daughters do, they write about clothes, they write about the weather, they write about the garden, what's going on in the garden. So I think relationships are complicated, and we can never truly know the relationship between Wilder and Lane, but I think they were very, very close. And as I've said before, when it comes to that editorial chemistry between them, it was magical, and I don't think we'll ever fully understand it.
Read Farmer Boy for the Food Alone. I remember, that's what I remember the most about that. My daughter read it and was just like, wow, these people eat a lot. So, well, thank you everybody for such great questions. And thank you so much, Pamela. I feel like I've learned a lot from your book, and I've learned a lot from these questions too. These are really fabulous. So I really appreciate this chance to talk to you.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you everyone for the great questions. They were just absolutely delightful. And I just encourage you to dive back into the Little House books and rediscover them all over again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.